The Portent Tide Research Podcast is about interviewing researchers and providing an insight into their field and how they think of their field overall. It is specific in exploring and documenting some of their current or past research, from the preconception of their hypothesis right through to the communication of their findings, delving into their decision-making process along the way. And the discussion is generalized in hearing their thoughts on key themes within research and what their line of work takes and requires of them. The aim of Portent Tide is to put the science researchers undertake into a format that is more engaging, with the capacity to reach further out to larger audiences, with a determination to maintain quality and trust with researchers by publishing the discussion in full only upon the approval of the researcher. This podcast is a conversation with Estefania Fernandez, discussing her PhD research into the decaying process of fallen trees within fragments of tropical forests and plantations in the region surrounding Las Cruces Biological Station in southern Costa Rica. The decomposition of trees is a process of chemical, physical, and biological weathering. Estefania was measuring factors related to and caused by this weathering. We discuss her research process and decisions made informing her hypotheses and methods, as well as the difficulty imposed by the data collection and field component of her research. We also explore key themes within research and how Estefania navigates the challenges within these themes. It was my pleasure hearing about this work. Understanding how tropical forest decomposition occurs provides an insight into a broad array of systems and how they perform the necessary function of decaying over time. Thank you for listening and enjoy the podcast. Awesome. So I guess where we start is, well, first of all, thanks for sitting down with me and introduce yourself and your background, and yeah, let's go from there.
Okay. So my name is Estefania. I'm originally from Bolivia, and I am entering my 5th year of my PhD dissertation in biology and ecology, and I'm focusing my research on tropical forest restoration. So that's basically when there's a forest that has been deforested or disturbed, we just try to figure out how to help it recover faster so that it can achieve the levels of biodiversity that are present in forests that have not been disturbed.
Okay, cool. So that's the overall aim in general. In terms of that, is that the hypothesis as well, or more?
So that's the general.
That's the general aim.
Project,
yeah, right, yeah.
And I am particularly working with dead wood. Okay. So I'm seeing how different ways of doing forest restoration help the amounts of dead wood on the ground to recover after a disturbance. Okay,
so that's good to hear, because what I want to know is, so first, as I sort of discussed about in the search, I suppose, where did you start when you began looking at forest recovery, and what led you to the dead wood factor and researching that?
So what led me to the dead wood factor, well, I guess there were different things. It was not necessarily a question I came up to because I was interested in it. I mean, of course, obviously dead wood is very important for insects and decomposition and all that. But actually, I was going to do my dissertation on epiphytes, which is plants that live on top of other plants.
Yep.
And I had to climb trees, so I ended up deciding I didn't want to climb up trees. And so I think in my 3rd year, I had to decide I didn't want that. And one advisor told me, what do you think about coarse weed debris? And I was like, yeah, I'll look into that.
It's on the ground.
Yeah, it's on the ground. That sounds nice because I hadn't worked with insects, and it's related to insects because insects have their homes there. Many insects, not all of them. So I started looking a little bit into what coarse weedy debris was, and I was interested, so I ended up doing my dissertation with that.
Okay, awesome. Awesome. So how did you narrow, once you started looking at the dead wood, how did you narrow down factors to say, this is what I want to research specifically about this topic?
How did I narrow that?
Yeah.
Well, I guess for me it was more of a matter of what I could logistically do, and sometimes that can happen in science. So I knew I had already experience with insects, and I know they are very dependent on that wood, and they are also very important to be recovered in the restoration sites. So I decided I was going to look into how the restoration treatments recover dead wood, but also the insects that are associated to it.
Awesome. Okay. All right. So you state the hypothesis one more time, so I just hear the
Okay,
the
so the
variables.
hypothesis is, um, let me try to say it in an easy way.
Yeah. I understood. I just want to hear, because I want to hear the variables again, just to hear specifically, like
Yeah.
how many different factors are there within the hypothesis, or is it being broken down into several elements that you're studying?
There are several elements. So there's several hypotheses.
Yeah, that's what I'm
Yes.
curious about.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the first one is how do different restoration treatments allow the reaccumulation of dead wood on the forest ground?
Okay.
And so the first hypothesis would be that restoration plantations, which is places that you have planted with native trees, are more efficient at reaccumulating dead wood on the forest ground compared to places that where you have just fenced around and just excluded the cattle.
Okay. Right. And so wait.
Uh,
So yeah, we'll list them all, and then
okay.
we'll move from there.
The second one is more related to the insects that live inside the dead wood. So it would be how do different restoration treatments, in this case the plantations or the naturally regenerated vegetation, allow the recovery of insects that live inside that wood, to levels that are currently existing in forests that have not been disturbed. So basically, I'm going to compare insects inside the wood in those three treatments. So old growth forest, plantation, and naturally regenerated vegetation. And the hypothesis again would be that plantations are better at recovering the insects compared to naturally regenerated vegetation, just because plantations you already have a structure where there's trees, those trees might die, branches might fall, and so that's just automatically going to provide habitat for insects to colonize.
Fantastic.
And then the third one, I guess it's kind of unrelated to the first two. It's more related to the decomposition, but decomposition is also very important cycle of an ecosystem that we want to recover with restoration. So the question is, does coarse woody debris decay faster or slower in different restoration treatments?
Okay.
And so the hypothesis is that it's going to decay the fastest in forests that have not been disturbed, at a medium speed in plantations, because in plantations you have a canopy, you have a high humidity, and then the slowest in naturally regenerated vegetation, which is typically composed of a lot of grasses and there's a lot of sun. So that, in theory, that should slow down decomposition.
Awesome. So why did you choose this location? Or simply say, you can explain where we are as well.
Well, I did my master's dissertation here, and I did it in those sites as well.
Okay,
That's
right.
what I'm using now. And I knew I wanted to work with for something related to forest restoration, but it's difficult to start a forest restoration project for your PhD dissertation because that would involve planting treelets somewhere where there's nothing, and that requires a lot of time. So these sites were already established, and I already knew the researchers, and so I figured, why don't I ask them if I can work in their sites and just measure how much dead wood is in the floor of those forests.
Awesome. Okay. So how does the basically what narrowed it really down is the familiarity with place, as I get it out. Can you explain how this specific site in relation to the fragmentation works, and in relation to how that functions with your research as well?
You mean the biological station?
Yeah. Well, I guess. So you're saying you're working between plantations, old forest growth, and okay. So I'm wondering how does that factor in with the farmland around here, or the different fragments as well? Is there any interaction between?
I am not sure, but the fragment here in this area, the area is very, very fragmented. So there's like small forest patches everywhere, and sometimes there's coffee plantations, and then you have a pasture land. That's pretty much what it is. And all my sites are surrounded by that. And fortunately, all of them have one old growth forest that I can compare things
Okay.
to.
Right, sure.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that's really a different factor altogether, like the really addressing like fragmentation. Okay,
Yes. Yeah.
awesome. Well, let's explore the method. What, like, how did you, other than location, how did you narrow things down from there?
For methods, okay, let's see. So for measuring deadwood volumes, which is what I am is using for proxy of amount of logs that are in the ground. I'm just measuring their volume. I just looked up papers that had measured deadwood volumes in forests, and there's several ways to do it. Sometimes people, draw a line and they measure every log that falls on that line. But the calculations are kind of hard, and then I think you can estimate biomass if you have certain data, but you can't estimate volume. And then there's this other method that I'm using that I found on these papers where you establish a transect, which is like a strip line basically, and you measure the diameter and the length of any logs falling within that transect, and then you calculate volume as a cylinder, and it's pretty easy.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it sounds complicated, but I get it. I understand it, like from previous experience. Okay. So, and what are the measures in relation to collecting insects? And you said that you're looking at biodiversity, but
Yeah.
What?
So for capturing insects, what I'm doing is pitfall traps. It's these plastic cups that you fill with water and soap, and that I guess you bury them on the ground so that the rim of the cup is at level with the ground, and so soap breaks surface tension, so any insects that are walking there unattentively and fall won't be able to escape. And so I'm putting those traps near logs that I put in those restoration sites last year, and also far away from them, to see how the diversity of insects differs between being very close to the log and far away from the log. And so in theory, the insects that are more associated with the log should be more present in the traps that are close to the logs, and then other types of insects should be in the traps that are far away from them.
Okay. All right. And the last factor?
Decomposition. So decomposition, I am measuring. Okay, so last year when I came here, I caught 300 pieces of wood of like very similar size and the same species, and I put all of them distributed in the restoration sites, let them there for a year, and then before introducing them, of course, I weigh them. And so now I retrieve them and I'm weighing them again to figure out how much mass they've lost. And so normally they should be lighter now, because normally they should have lost mass.
Okay, awesome.
Obviously, I'm drying them before doing that, because water can confuse a lot of things.
Awesome. So let's talk about what you found so far, like in your data collection and coming back here. First of all, coming back here, what was that like in terms of returning, and finding whatever you've found? Was it a surprise, or?
Part of it was a surprise, especially the logs. And I haven't analyzed that data yet, but they were not nearly as decomposed as I had expected them to be.
Really? Okay.
No. So, yeah. I mean, now that I'm drying them, I can see that many of them were very eaten by insects. So, maybe it was a first impression. But yeah, I was very scared that I wasn't going to find any effect. And I don't know that I'll find any effect, because maybe it's been too little time.
Okay. I have just a question of that. How do the insects eat the logs? In terms of, is it they chew out through the core?
Yes. So sometimes they will. So I think they might be entering the logs mostly through the sides, because these were cut down logs. Or if there's like a knot that has a little hole, that's where they come in from. And so typically it's wood-eating insects. So mostly beetles. I saw a few centipedes.
Okay, cool. And is that what you're finding? That's in the pitfall traps, what you're finding there, or is that within the wood itself?
That is within the wood itself.
Okay, all right.
And in the pitfall traps, I'm actually finding completely different things, mostly ants.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. So, out of interest, what were the beetles? Were there any dung beetles in relation to that?
I don't think that they were dung beetles. I have some samples that I still need to get identified.
Okay.
So I don't know what they are.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued. I'm
Yeah.
intrigued. So in placing, so so basically you're at the data collection phase. So it's difficult to just break into
Well,
a discussion. But
it's kind of collected, but I just analyzed things for chapter 2, which is how the volumes of debt would evolve through time.
okay,
And so I guess the answer is they increase, and they increase very fast from 0 to 50 years, and then they kind of stabilize from 50 to over 100 years old.
what does that stabilization mean, though?
It means there's a plateau. So I guess in terms of, I'm trying to think of it in terms of how forests regenerate, which I guess makes sense. So like if you, for example, if you go somewhere and you deforest a place, and if you do what typically people do here, which is use all the logs that you've cut down for firewood, then there will be none left in the ground.
Okay.
So if you go to those sites that are pretty young, like 5-year-old or 7-year-old, you won't find anything. So the volumes of deadwood are low. And then slowly trees will start colonizing that site, and eventually branches will fall, or other trees might die, and so you might start finding more and more deadwood until there's a closed enough canopy in the forest that you can have bigger trees establishing, like
Okay.
old growth forest trees.
Sure.
And so those typically will have a lot larger diameters and will be taller. So, I assume that's around 50 years old because that's where my curve is plateauing.
Okay, interesting.
And so in those situations, then we found trees that have fallen completely, not by wind or branches, and so those are much, much bigger. And I think at that point in succession, there's this mix of very old growth forest trees that are really large, but also pioneer trees that are medium sized, and so there's constantly this like deadwood falling and falling, and so that makes it be really high and like kind of like stable over time.
Wow. Okay. All right. So maybe we can get into these questions, and we'll kind of sort of break down the decision making from there. So I guess we'll start from the start. So the question is motivation, and you did touch on it in relation to looking at forest regeneration. But I guess what my question comes down to, what was it that really made you interested? Was it, say, for example, curiosity? Or was it a sense of difficulty, for example? Or was it something else entirely?
For this particular topic?
For this particular topic and in general.
Okay. So I did my PhD because I initially was interested in tropical forest restoration. I guess because being from Bolivia, I've seen how my forests have been deforested really badly. And so I wanted to be able to learn how to correct that.
Okay.
And so obviously within my PhD dissertation, as I said before, it is too little of a time. I just have 5 years to like start a project, but I guess the PhD is a means to an end where I'm like already working in a restoration sites. I'm already seeing certain things change in the restoration sites, like the deadwood here. And yeah, so hopefully this will lead me to a job in tropical forest restoration. So I guess in my case, I'm a scientist, but I'm not really a scientist that is that driven by curiosity or difficulty. It's more like forests are disappearing and I want them to see back.
Okay, yeah, no, that's interesting because I am interested in whether there are a lot of people who have outcome orientation, and it is very clear within conservation that there's a clear goal.
Yeah.
There's a clear goal there.
Yeah.
But the interesting side to that question is, of course, that as you go, you're going to learn things that will help along the way.
Yeah.
So, so I suppose with this we'll get to the adaptation side after a moment, but. What is it that I've got the question on trust involved in completing the search during preparation. So the idea of trusting people that you don't necessarily know or don't have connections with, and then beginning this research and say you've got that outcome in mind, is that weighing on your mind in that search process to find the right information that will inform your research to hopefully help you in that with that outcome?
I I guess. So the thing currently with my research is that I think I might be the first or second person who has evaluated how deadwood amounts vary through time in tropical forests. We know how they vary very well in the northern hemisphere, but not here. So in that regard, I guess the most I could do was look for methods, a lot of methods, and then try to compare what I get to what other people have gotten. So yeah, I guess I did all I could to like find the best, the maximum amount of papers that would give me good methods, and then I just came here and started my research.
Okay.
And I'll have to trust that it'll be what I expect, but also like if it's not what I expect, it's still interesting because it's still answering something.
Right. Well, it really is addressing something. And at the very least, it sounds like you're ruling something out if you get somewhere. So you've really addressed the idea of risk already there within that. It's just like it sounds like you're accepting that risk if that's
But I think I see research like that too, and I guess my advisor is this way too. It's not. So when you establish a hypothesis, it's because you're asking a question it's because maybe you've observed things that you think are in a certain way, and you're asking the question to do the research to figure out if that's true. But if it's not true, it's not a bad thing because you might find an even more interesting pattern. And like Bob says, like negative results are also results, and sometimes very interesting results.
Right.
So
I completely agree. Well, you just said there was very little background research. So I wonder if the idea has even come into your head, the idea of risking and challenging past research. Mm-hmm. Given that there's no past research, I suppose you didn't really have too much of that
I didn't
involved.
have that much of it challenging.
But what if there's within other research, there's been a lot of research that goes into regenerating forests.
Uh-huh.
Was there any information you found within that was not lining up with what you were finding in any manner?
Let me think. Well, I guess more than challenging, I probably have just found that the pattern of recovery of dead wood here is very different than in northern forests or northern hemisphere forests.
Okay.
Yeah, because typically the pattern of recovery in those forests is the shape of a U. So there's a lot of dead wood at the beginning, then it starts decomposing, so it disappears, then it goes down, and eventually goes back up. And mine is very different because it's like low at the beginning, intermediate, then high and stable.
Okay,
it's just completely different. Yeah.
Is that? Do you think that's a commonality in tropical locations, or?
I guess we'd have to do more
more
chronosequences all over the tropics to see that.
That's not a bad thing. All right. Well, yeah. I suppose some of these questions are hard because they're clearly linked, but in relation to expectations. So is there a point that I'll just read this out. Is there a point that a trust in the selected method should be adopted? So I'm really saying, so I'm trying to weigh up, you have these expectations, but you also need to be prepared to be adaptable.
Yes, definitely. Definitely. Because sometimes, I'm trying to think. I know last year I had to be very adaptable for some things, but it was more, I guess I pretty much continued with the methods I had established. It was more a thing of like, we decided we're going to put things this way and we're going to put this many logs. And then I was like, well, I mean, logistically, I cannot introduce 1,000 logs in these sites. Like, that'll take me a year. So maybe I'll introduce less. Or, for the pitfall traps, there was a way of doing, a little roof for the traps that, some papers said, but I didn't have the materials nor the workforce here to do that. So I just used bamboo sticks and plastic dishes to do the roofs. And sometimes also too, it's I guess adaptable too, because I wasn't here in the pandemic. So for the full month of May, I couldn't go out. So that was delaying me. So I guess in that sense, you just have to be adaptable and find out something that you can advance and do.
Awesome. All right. So I've got the idea of cooperation. And so all this research has been done solely by yourself? Or
Oh, no. I've had many helpers.
Awesome. So
Yeah.
I have two questions within that. I mean, please, by all means, continue. But I have two questions that is just like simply on what type of people do you rely on in terms of expertise? And well, actually, let's just go with that question for now. Yeah.
So last year, it was a little hard for me. I was actually really lucky, and I will definitely think of this next time I hire an assistant, because I hired someone who hadn't any experience in the field. He had experience in construction, so I was a little bit scared about how things would go. But also the job we were doing was not really difficult. So I think, and it ended up being great because this guy knew how to build everything, like all the exclusions from my logs. We made them super, super nicely. He knew so many things that I thought, like, yeah, this is a great combination.
Construction scientist.
Get yourself someone who knows how to construct many things.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, second last question is on that satisfaction in this process. And dissatisfaction. Yeah. So, is there a point in the research process that you find most enjoyable, also most easy, or
maybe let's start by what's the most difficult.
Okay, go from there.
Yeah, I guess the most difficult part is establishing your hypotheses. Like after you've read about that wood and the forest, you're like, well, what hypothesis could I ever propose that is gonna make sense?
Yep.
And yeah, starting that is hard. Starting writing is really difficult for me too, especially the introduction of the paper, because that's where you have to sell your idea and like say why it's important. And like most people, of course, don't care about dead logs on the ground. Yeah, and the most enjoyable. I guess I enjoy field work. I don't really enjoy field work, but what I enjoy about it is that I can see things that I would not normally see in a typical day, because I'm here. So like we had to walk for long times sometimes, and so we would see like monkeys and all sorts of animals, even though we came back devoured by chiggers. It was worth it because we get to see that. And also seeing that some of my hypotheses are actually true, that I was right. So that means that all the research that I did, that I thought I had done a good enough job to be able to predict certain things, was obviously good, because the results are proving that what I was hypothesizing is correct.
So it's somewhat gratifying, I suppose.
Yes, it is gratifying.
Okay. Yeah. Second last question. I'm interested in this. So that question on responsibility after going through all this, especially after you talked about how there's only 2 papers done on this, so it seems absolutely necessary that you say what. So speak to that.
Well, I think I will definitely say that there needs to be more research, especially because there's been papers recently that have shown that insects are declining, and given that dead pieces of wood on the ground are so important to them, I think it's even more important to do the research, especially in tropical forests, to like see how this element is recovered, and if it is recovering at all. I mean, we don't know that. And so if that habitat is being provided for those organisms that use it.
Okay. And it might be jumping the gun, but would you recommend the same approach, or would you recommend anything new?
I think a chronosequence would be a good
Say one more time. I didn't hear. What did you say?
Oh, sorry. A chronosequence. Okay, so I didn't explain that. Sorry.
No, good.
A chronosequence is a set of sites that have a similar history. So all my sites were former coffee plantations, and that are of increasing ages. So you basically substitute space for time. So if I have like one forest that's 5 years old, one that's 10 years old, then 20, 30, etc., I'll measure deadwood volumes in all of them, and I'll assume that if I was, waiting 30 or 40 years doing that every time. It is the same pattern that would be happening. I'm not sure if that's clear.
I think I do understand.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Okay, so the final question, I actually didn't write it, but it's sort of addressing what I'm doing, and it's just about doing your take on science communication, what you think of it in general.
Oh, I think it's very important.
Yeah.
I think maybe more important than research itself.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you elaborate on where it's important and what's maybe where you thought it's been successful and not successful?
Well, I guess I'm more in the area of conservation, so in that sense, I definitely think it's just important to inform people about, the importance of biodiversity and why is it important to protect it. And I think maybe that might be more involved just in education in general of people.
What's your take on their understanding of it? Especially the complexity.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I guess at least here, every time you go, you have to ask permission to a certain farmer to measure dead logs on their forest ground. And yeah, they were like, yeah, why do you want to measure? Just sure, measure those logs. I mean, I don't care. I'm going to use it for firewood. And so, yeah, it's interesting when you try to explain them that that's good, that there's nice insects, but then they tell you, no, but insects will eat my crop.
Okay.
Right? So you have to find ways to explain to them, yeah, some insects are bad, but a lot of those insects will pollinate your crop and then allow you to gather fruit afterwards. So you have, there has to be a balance.
And well, do you find that they're receptive to that information or?
Some of them. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, I think that wraps everything up. I appreciate it. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Portent Tide is independent from the researchers on the podcast. If you wish to support them in any manner, a link is provided from the researcher to allow for this. This can be found on Portent Tide YouTube channel, Instagram, and directly through the Portent Tide website. If you enjoyed the podcast and you wish to support Portent Tide produce more conversations like this that provide an insight into how researchers work, you can do so directly through the links provided on the Portent Tide website or through wherever you found this podcast. Thank you again for listening, and any support and feedback is much appreciated.